Now, once again, as I said before, I made a phone call and said, I need someone to play the part of Harriet Tubman. And I found her. So without any further ado, Linda Dahl.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to tell you the story of Harriet Tubman, essentially my story. And I'll start from when Harriet was already a slave. She grew up in slavery, was born as a slave, grew up working a little bit in the house, like domestic stuff, but then she was working in the fields. And this starts from after she received an injury from working in the fields. Harriet was not the same after she got well. She suffered from headaches. Sometimes she had sleeping spells. One minute she might be awake and talking, the next she would be sound asleep. The spells frightened her. She heard a rumor. Mr. Brodus, her master, was going to sell her. He would sell some of her brothers, too. What would happen to her? She might be sent farther south to New Orleans, Louisiana, or to Natchez, Mississippi, in a chain gang. In a chain gang, slaves were chained together at ankles to prevent their escape. The trip south would be long and hard. If Harriet fell asleep on the road, the overseer would whip her. He might whip her very hard and leave her to die. Her brothers would not be able to save her. Even if she could survive the trip, Harriet knew that being sold someplace farther south was a bad thing. That was where so many of the cotton plantations were. Working in the cotton fields was very hard work. Also, going farther south meant she would be farther from northern states, further from freedom. Harriet did not want to be a slave all her life. She wanted desperately to be free. Harriet began to pray that Mr. Brodus would die. To her amazement, he did get sick and died soon after, and Harriet found that she was sorry. She believed it was wrong to have prayed for his death, but now she had a new owner who was more fair. His name was Dr. Thompson, and he hired Harriet and her father out to a builder named John Stewart. She initially swept and dusted and washed clothes in the house, but she hated that work. She preferred to work outside with the men. And she was soon working alongside them, cutting down trees. She was a good worker, and Mr. Stewart let her take other jobs. She had to give Stewart part of the money that she earned, but she could keep some of it. Harriet looked for more outdoor work, hauling logs, plowing fields. She worked for 5 years for this builder. She became even stronger with all this work, even more capable. She was more than 21 years old now, all grown up. Her father kept teaching her things too. He taught her how to move through the woods without making a sound. He showed her how to find the North Star near the Big Dipper. The North Star was a guiding light for slaves. It showed the way north, the way to freedom. Ben told his daughter that with the North Star in sight, you would know you were headed in the right direction. But what if there were cloudy nights and the stars were hidden? Ben told his daughter to feel the trees for moss. Moss grew only on the north sides of trees. Even without the North Star, the moss could help a traveler. Harriet listened to what her father had to say. She remembered his words. In time, they would help her. In 1844, when she was about 23, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. John's parents had been slaves, but their master freed his slaves at the time of his death, so John was born free. John and Harriet made plans to marry. Harriet sewed a quilt of different scraps of cloth, so it was her wedding quilt. She had difficulty making this quilt, but she ultimately completed it. John and Harriet were happy with their lives. They liked the money that she made. They had their own cabin. Life was pretty good. But what if her owner wanted to sell her? Then she would be separated from her husband. She kept thinking about escaping and begged her husband to go with her, to go north with her. They would follow the North Star. In the north, Harriet would be a free woman. They would both be free. But John did not want to leave home. It was too dangerous. What would they eat? How would they live? He told Harriet to put escaping out of her mind, but she couldn't. She told him the dreams she had. She kept dreaming of freedom. John told Harriet that if she tried to escape, he would tell the master, so he would rat her out. So then Harriet began to fear her husband, since he did not share her dream of freedom. If she wanted to go north, she would have to do it without her husband. So one day, Harriet was working in a field close to the road. A white woman drove up in a buggy. She wore the plain clothes of a Quaker. She began to talk to Harriet. She asked Harriet her name and asked how she was injured. She had a scar on her forehead. Harriet knew the Quakers didn't believe in slavery. She could talk to the white woman. She could trust her. The woman came again on other days, and if no one was watching them, they spoke. She told Harriet that if she ever needed help, she could ask her. In 1849, bad news came to the plantation. Harriet and some of her family were to be sold, so now she would have no way to escape. She told her brothers, and they made a plan. That night, she waited till her husband was asleep. Then she went to meet her brothers. They moved through the woods. Her brothers made so much noise, and they grew frightened. Escape was too risky. They were going back. Harriet had to go with them. She had said no, she would go alone, but they forced her to return. So 2 late nights later, the slave trader would be coming for Harriet and her brothers. So she faced a hard choice. Should she, get sold, or should she go alone? And she decided to go alone. She decided to run away by herself. And when her husband was asleep, she got up and just packed a little bit of cornbread and some salt pork and a bandana. She took the quilt she made, and that's all she could take. She didn't dare take any more. But finally, so she slipped out of the house, and finally she was on her way to freedom, to her way north. She was going to make her dream come true. So she walked in the dark through the woods, moved without making a sound. She followed what her father had told her, and kept free of the bloodhounds from walking through water. She came to the house of the Quaker woman who she met earlier, and she let her in. But she knew that it wasn't safe for Harriet to stay at her house. So she sent her on her way and told her what to do next, how to get to the north. Harriet wanted to thank the woman, and she didn't know how, so she gave her the wedding quilts as she said goodbye. Harriet had a long trip ahead of her. First, she followed the local river, the Choptank River in Maryland. When it got light, she hid. When it was dark, she started moving again. The river was 40 miles long, and it was only the start of her trip. It was a slow trip, and when the river ended, she wound up in Camden, Delaware. She looked for a white house with green shutters. The woman in the house was named Eliza Hunn. She let Harriet stay with her for 3 days. She gave her new clothes and food for the trip, and Harriet set out again. Harriet had become a traveler on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad had no tracks or cars, but it had a series of stops, homes or stores where stores of Quakers and abolitionists, where runaway slaves could find shelter. The Underground Railroad had its own special code words to trick the white slave owners. Escaping slaves might be called bundles, parcels, or packages. 1 bale of cotton might mean 1 slave. 2 bales might mean that 2 small bales might mean that the escaping slaves were children. Slave hunters were everywhere. They got rewards for bringing back runaway slaves. Harriet knew her master would be looking for her. She used her bandana to cover her scar and traveled at night. Sometimes she dressed as a man or a fancy lady. In these clothes, she was safer. And finally, she reached Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, she was a free woman. So she looked at her hands and saw that she was the same person. Here's a quote. She said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees, and over the fields, I felt like I was in heaven." But freedom was not easy. Years later, Harriet said, "I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." It was true. Her home, her family, her friends were back in Maryland. One day she would go back to get them. Harriet took a job cooking and cleaning in a Philadelphia hotel. She did not like the word compared to being a slave. It was easy. All the money she earned was hers. And if she truly hated her job, she could leave it. No one could force her to stay. After work, she visited the offices of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. This was a group of people who helped runaway slaves. The men and women were sometimes had news of Harriet's family back home. Harriet learned that his sister Mary and Mary's family were going to be sold. So Harriet decided to go back to Maryland. Her sister's family needed her. William Still was the secretary of the Vigilance Committee, and he was her friend. He warned her not to go. It was too dangerous, but she wouldn't listen. A clever plan was devised. Harriet's Quaker friends got the plan to John Bowley. He was married to Harriet's her sister Mary. John was a free man, although his wife and children were slaves. By the time John got the plan, his family had already been taken to the slave auction, but they had not been sold yet. It was lunchtime, and the auctioneer was taking a break. He would sell the rest of the slaves after he had eaten. Right then, John Bowley walked to the slave pen. In his hand, he held a large white envelope with a message inside. He handed it to a guard watching the slaves. The message said that Mary's master already had a buyer for her and the children. John was to take Mary and their children to the inn where the auctioneer was having lunch. The message was a trick. It was not from Mary's master, but the guard did not suspect anything. John took Mary and the children. Quickly they went down the street, but they did not go to the inn to find the auctioneer. They were escaping in the middle of the day. They tried to walk calmly so as not to attract attention. Finally, after what seemed like a long walk, they came to a house with a picket fence. Inside was a Quaker man. He was the one who had written the message. The Quaker took the family up to his attic. Night came. The family crept out into the wagon. The Quaker man covered them with blankets and drove them to a river. A fishing boat filled with blankets and food was waiting for them. John sailed the boat up the Chesapeake River in Maryland. He was told to sail toward Baltimore. He had to look for two lights, one blue and one yellow. John sailed all night long. As morning came, he worried. How would he see the lights in the daytime? But he did, and he guided the boat to them. A white woman was on the shore sitting in a wagon. "Who are you?" she asked. "A friend with friends," John answered, for this was the code phrase he had been told to say. The woman greeted him warmly and helped the family into her wagon. She covered them with blankets and bags of onions and potatoes. Next, she drove them to a stable where they got out of the wagon and waited until dark. They waited in the stable until dark. Then she had helped them back into the wagon and drove them to a brick house in Maryland. The white woman knocked on the door, and when they all went inside, there was Harriet waiting for them. She had arranged for the boats and for the wagons. Now she was ready to lead them north. John and Mary saw that Harriet had a pistol. She had bought it with the money she earned. Armed with the gun and her knowledge of the swamps, Harriet led her sister's family from station to station on the Underground Railroad. They hid during the day and traveled at night. At times they walked. At other times they went by boat or wagon. Finally, they arrived safely in Philadelphia. It was the first time Harriet had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but it was certainly not the last.